Tacoma, Washington has two slogans that it's had over the years. If you put them together, when rails meet sails, city of destiny, that's a haiku, which says something or other about the history of Tacoma, but it doesn't say enough. So I decided I would try some cartographic forensics to expand the story. In the early 19th century, after the great powers of Europe had finally dispatched that great disruptor, Napoleon Bonaparte, they made a series of legal agreements in the early 1820s to figure out a way that they would coordinate in divvying up the rest of North America that they didn't already occupy in a way to preclude having another war with each other, at least for a while. This map by John Messer from 1823 ostensibly is a map of the United States, but it's actually a map of the collaborative cooperation of the empires in carving up North America, including the nascent American Empire. If we look at what we now call the Pacific Northwest, the light chartreuse line at the bottom is the negotiated northern boundary of New Spain, now known as Mexico. The pinky lines on either side, Vancouver Island and over there, are traditionally British. So above that line is what we call Canada. There's a gap there, meaning that the space between Mexico and Canada in that area had not yet been decided. By 1838, it had been decided that this was part of the American Empire, and specifically the territory of Oregon. Well, what is Oregon? Where did that name come from? It clearly meant much larger area than it does now, the state of Oregon. Nobody really knows for sure where the actual name came from, but research over time has made it very clear that it's got to be related to the story of this fish, which its common scientific name is converged on eulachone. It's an oil fish captured in nets in shallow waters with prodigious amounts of fish oil rendered out of it. My friend and colleague Scott Byram has spent many years working on the etymology of the fish and the fish oil based on it, starting way up in southeast Alaska and ending up on the Oregon coast. Nearly 1,000-mile spread, many different language families. But the key thing is that all these names are different, but they're all kind of related in that they almost all of them are three-syllable words that begin with a vowel sound and end with N. And they all relate to this fish. So Oregon isn't on the list, but it complies with the rules. Oregon. The fish and the fish oil are part of systems, an ecological system, but also a social and political system, because the whole point of the harvesting of the fish oils was to provide a dense, nutrient-dense, nutritious oil that could get people through the winter. And this system lasted well into the 20th century. This is a Bella Coola man in 1922 with a steamed bentwood cedar box filled with fish oil that he's prepared to take from the coast up over the mountains to the interior horse Indians on the other side of the range. So this is all about reciprocal trade agreements, maritime products from the coastal people going back inland, and animal skins and chunks of obsidian and all kinds of things going back from the interior Indians, and summer festivals up in the Huckleberry Meadows in the summer where they would all meet. So this is Oregon as a verb, basically. And you can see this in this map from 1846 that there's no attribution to it, but it's one of many special rare maps in the American Geographical Society Library in Milwaukee, which also includes the special and rare Susan Peschel. So this version of Oregon goes way up above Vancouver Island, and it goes way inland. So, and it has all of these areas of Indian distributions and their names. All this was changing rapidly, even by 1846. This map, that previous map might have had something to do with George Gibbs, who was a profoundly gifted linguist of this area. But this map, also in the AGSL, is definitely from Gibbs. He overprinted on an army map. Seattle is a thing. Tacoma doesn't yet exist, but where it says Point Defiance, that's the mouth of the bay. And there are place names, Steilacoom, Puyallup, Duwamish. They represent names of rivers, which also are the people who live along those rivers. But there's one exception, Muckleshoot, over inland. Muckleshoot was a place name. It was actually a place with a lot of flat land where the Army pastured cavalry horses. And it ended up becoming the nascent Muckleshoot Indian Reservation. This map is about from 1857. The Muckleshoot Reservation was essentially a refugee camp because there were members of bands of Duwamish and Puyallup and people from all over the lower area and interior of Puget Sound who'd been displaced by the Army, by settlers who were stealing their land, etc. So they ended up at Muckleshoot. Unfortunately, you can't really see well on this extension of this map, but there's these little red lines. There's from Muckleshoot going out to that river and going over, and then going over to the pass and down into the lands of the horse Indians like the Yakima and so on. This is Oregon in action. These are the trails that were used for that reciprocal exchange. The next year, 1857, the U.S. Army did this map showing the beginnings of the Puyallup Reservation at the bottom of Commencement Bay. Note there's still no Tacoma, and the Muckleshoot Reservation over there. And you can see the developing, fragmentation of the land into township and range, into the essence of white people, geometry, land use, ownership that's coming down. In 1876, John Wesley Powell, as he was forming the American Bureau of Ethnology, he published this lovely Kromah Lithograph of the language distributions in that area, a major part of that area that you saw in the 1846 map, from the notes of George Gibbs, who had died tragically and suddenly. So he was gone. If we look at a close-up part of it, there's Tacoma is now a thing. The railroad, the Northern Pacific Railroad has reached it. And then there are the various reservations, Nisqually, Puyallup, Muckleshoot, etc. But the note on the map says, in 1876, this map represents the historic distribution of languages and populations. Things are now greatly altered by restrictions and changes with the reservations and also extinctions of populations and tribes. This is the route of the North Pacific Railroad that came around along the Columbia River and came up to Tacoma and an extension over there. It looks like it missed people like the Muckleshoots and so on, but that's not the case. One of the most important graphics for understanding Tacoma is Under the Black Cloud, published in 1880. The Northern Pacific Railroad was one of many railroads that were built under the tutelage, under the sponsorship and partnership of the federal government. The Northern Pacific Railroad Syndicate was a rotating group of people who can only be described as criminal robber barons who constantly undercut and displaced each other to build the railroad. But the way that they were induced to build the railroad was that wide swath of black cloud was the land that the federal government was giving them in part. The land would be divided in checkerboards, just like the checkerboards you'd seen earlier. Every odd number square would go to the Northern Pacific, The even numbered squares wouldn't. So checkerboard, checkerboard, checkerboard. This was, in theory, the largest single transfer of public lands to private lands in the history of the United States. Nothing else was remotely like this. But there's a problem there because when you talk about the land as public, because the land that was transferred, the odd number squares were overlaid on top of every single treaty, reservation, compromise, promise that had been made before. So from one day to the next in 1875, this became the Muckleshoot Reservation. And whatever else, I think it's pretty clear to most of us that this was not planned by the Muckleshoots. So the city of Destiny had a lot of winners. You can see their mansions, you can see their fancy buildings in the downtown. But a whole lot of people and a whole lot of ecosystems paid the cost for those benefits. And people like the Muckleshoot are still paying. 147 years later, this is still the boundaries of the res. But the upside of the game is the city of Destiny, Tacoma, as mapped by the Coast Survey in 1880. They planned big from the very beginning. This was about 1890, was a sort of a concept of what was going to happen with Tacoma. Now, there's a couple of cartographic problems with this. One of them is if the geopositioning of Tacoma on Commencement Bay is correct, then the great mountain in the background, which is Tacoma, known to the gringos as Mount Rainier, is actually sitting on top of Seattle. The actual mountain is over there. The second problem is that the great mountain doesn't look like that. It looks like that. And these people ought to know. So the railroad was in place, and this system developed that completely overthrew Oregon as a verb. This is a lovely thing. This is one of Hal Shelton's, the great cartographic artist. This is a map base he painted in oil paints on paper on a zinc plate for Gusha in 1962 as background for aeronautical charts. So you can see that basically what had been a system of reciprocal exchange back and forth across the mountains from the ocean to the inland is now export-oriented gathering of resources, of timber from the woods, of oats and wheat grown in that vast interior, beautiful Columbia Basin, of minerals and coal and everything else, all put on the railroad and sent around to Tacoma and sent out to the larger world. So if Tacoma had it made in the shade that way, how come Seattle became the giant city and Tacoma retired to that status of second or third tier American cities where NACIS likes to have its conferences? I would submit that the major reason for that was the discovery of gold in the Klondike and the rapid process of turning what had been part of the Russian Empire in North America, that had become part of the American Empire, now called Alaska, the same process of massive export-oriented resource extraction. So the dotted line coming out of Puget Sound that goes to the south, that was the route of the boats from Tacoma. Bulk cargo, timber and grains and so on, in sailing ships well into in the 20th century. Whereas if you were going to go up through the Aleutians and the Bering Sea to get towards the Yukon, that you went out in steamships from Seattle. So Seattle prospered. And a whole bunch of companies sprang up to aid people in getting there, particularly the Filson Company, for example, which still exists. It still does real high quality clothing for people who work outdoors. When I was a tree planter, I had as much Filson gear as I could afford. So recurrent theme about all the mining is that the vast majority of all the people who went off to make their fortunes in Alaska didn't, made almost nothing. But the people who serviced the miners in every way, they made out. And so there was a lot of sentiment about redistribution of the wealth associated with these things that led to, amongst other things, the Wobblies, the industrial workers of the world, who were very strong here in Tacoma and throughout the Pacific Northwest. So that's what I have to say about City of Destiny. But what's going to be the destiny of the City of Destiny, which brings up global warming and sea level rise? And much as I did at the conference in Norfolk, I think one of the biggest challenges in cartography is to help people grapple with the immensity of the problem of sea level rise and how to deal with it. This is a graphic from Geography of Risk that was published last month by Gilbert Gull, an excellent book. And his thesis is basically that one of the most intellectually easily compelling ways to deal with sea level rise is what's called coastal retreat, right? You pull back from the areas that are flooding ever more frequently, right? And you leave a buffer zone. But the problem is that the real estate next to the ocean is rapidly becoming the most expensive real estate there is, and that more and more of the resources of the federal government are being used to defend and armor properties of the richest people in the country. So the only way out is to figure out some way, amongst other things, to help people realize, to visualize the rationality of coastal retreat. So I was thinking, could there be a way that reverse chronology of Coast Survey cartography of Commencement Bay could be some sort of visualization of what might occur? And I thought, that's going to be tough. So I channeled one of the greatest modern people who grew up in Tacoma, the great artist Nico Case, who is not afraid to deal with global warming. And I asked Nico, astrally, could this possibly work? And she replied, Cloud, give it a try. What do you have to lose? But you can sell all kinds of things better if you do it by song. And I went, that's a great idea. So I thought, well, of course, I'll look in the Little Red Songbook of the Wobblies. And there's a song that began in 1874, and I'll only do a little part of it. And my background here is, this is a reasonably current NOAA chart of Commencement Bay, the kind of pretty reduced cartography they do these days. For everyone well, let me say it again. For the one that got rich in the mining, there's hundreds who stayed being poor. I made up my mind to try digging in something more certain and sure. No longer the slave to ambition. I laugh at the world and its shams, and I think of my happy condition, surrounded by acres of clams. Surrounded by acres of clams, surrounded by acres of clams. I think of my happy condition, surrounded by acres of clams. So, from Tacoma haiku to Tacoma feng shui, not Tai Chi, what is it? The movement thing. Yeah, okay. Retreat, restore. And it's that easy. Thank you.